I'm Bonnie Glaser, Managing Director of the Indo-Pacific Program at the German Marshall Fund of the United States. Welcome to the China Global Podcast. Critical minerals are required for the manufacturing of electronics, aerospace equipment, medical devices, renewable energy technologies, and many other things, making them really essential for a country's economic and national security. And these materials have been at the center of China's domestic and foreign policy for many decades. Moreover, China's ability to integrate internal industrial policies with foreign trade and investment policies has allowed Beijing to gain dominance in the market. Meanwhile, the U.S. has lagged behind China in terms of both access to and processing technology of critical minerals. The United States has been heavily dependent on China for its critical minerals and continues, I think, to struggle to find alternative suppliers. China has been announcing and imposing export restrictions on the United States in recent months. The most recent announcement was April 4th, when China announced restrictions on export of 7 rare earth elements. And that has, I think, really focused attention in the United States on growing vulnerabilities that the U.S. has. So how great are China's advantages in this space? What can the United States do to address overdependence that the United States is facing? Joining us today to answer these questions and discuss the issue of critical minerals, I'm really pleased to welcome Gracelin Baskaran. She's the director of the Critical Minerals Security Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, and she's a mining economist whose area of expertise is critical minerals and trade. So welcome to the China Global Podcast, Gracelin.
Bonnie, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Terrific. Let's start with just sort of a general question about what are the most important dependencies that the United States has in this area, and rare earths and critical minerals. And then we'll talk about why China has acquired such a great advantage and then what the U.S. is doing about it.
The United States is highly reliant on China for a wide range of critical minerals. We have about 55 minerals between the 50 on the Department of Interior list, plus about 5 more that the Trump administration has prioritized. Now, the difficulty isn't that China has all of the minerals, because they actually don't. But what they have done is learned how to source minerals strategically around the world. The critical choke point that we face today is that China processes a large share of minerals. So when we think about key base metals, they process between 60 and 90%. What China has shown that they're willing to do now is to weaponize these resources. So in the last 2 years, they've actually continued to increase the number of minerals they have cut us off of. And it started in June 2 years ago with germanium and gallium. Then we saw graphite, antimony, tungsten, and most recently rare earths. And a lot of these minerals, again, they come from around the world. Like China produces 60% of the world's rare earths, but they process over 90%. And so what this does is when they impose an export restriction on it, the U.S. has very limited alternate supplies that it can get minerals from.
So you did an interview with Fox at some point. You noted that China makes up for its low production of critical minerals in some areas by strategically sourcing them from Latin America, Africa, and Asia. And this isn't something that I think is widely discussed. We usually talk about, as you say, their own mining and processing. So what has China done in these regions to really gain dominant access to the critical mineral mines? And is this something that the United States is focused on actually trying to limit? Are we making our own inroads, or is China just going to continue to dominate this space? And maybe talk about some of the minerals that they're importing that they don't have.
So China has actually taken a coordinated approach to its mineral diplomacy. And what I mean is they actually have a couple tools in their toolkit. So the first thing they've used is strategic infrastructure investments, most notably the Belt and Road Initiative. And the Belt and Road Initiative has been used to do a few things in mining. The first thing is to support the infrastructure development around the mine. So we're talking about the roads, the energy, the rail, and the ports, because ultimately building a mine in a jurisdiction is one cost, but I've got to create the whole ecosystem to get those minerals up and out. It's one of the most energy intensive sectors in the world. It uses 38% of the world's industrial power, and then it's very expensive to move because it's heavy. So those investments have been one thing. The second thing they've done is they've used trade agreements strategically. With the Inflation Reduction Act, we hope to see an uptick, particularly from some Latin American countries. But the reality was China had free trade agreements too. So, when taken together by using concessional financing, infrastructure support, and trade agreements, they started to create a long term advantage. And we've seen this. So, copper and lithium, a lot of that comes from South America. Nickel is coming from Indonesia. Cobalt, they buy all like 96% of the Democratic Republic Congo cobalt, and the DRC produces 70% of the world's cobalt. So what we've seen is Africa, Latin America, Asia, it's basically the same play, but it's coming back to China for processing.
So I want to ask you about processing because everybody knows one of the reasons that China's become so dominant in this space is because it's incredibly environmentally harmful to process these critical minerals and rare earths. So is China developing new technologies then that are more environmentally friendly? Or is it continuing to just mine in the same way that is harmful, of course, not only to its own environment, but the rest of the world? And if they're doing this in developing countries, then also to their own space.
Jury's actually out on this one. I think the answer is actually both. I mean, for a lot of their commodities, they're still relying on extremely environmentally degrading practices. So they have some of the most high emissions aluminum refining, for example, right? We've seen significant dumping into the ocean from the Chinese nickel production in Indonesia. But China has a couple of advantages when it comes to mining and processing R&D. The first thing is that they have a lot of technical know-how. So they've been doing this for so long and they produce so many mine engineers compared to the United States that they are always developing new technology. And they are able to get capital, which is the second consideration to deploy them. Here in the US, one of the critical barriers that we have in R&D is actually getting capital behind early stage projects and pilots. So China is also able to do that. So they are developing new R&D, but certainly their environmental practices are nothing to write home about.
You've written that China has deliberately suppressed the price of rare earths in the market. So, how have they gone about doing this, and what role does this play in their minerals diplomacy?
Market manipulation, if you had to give me a list of challenges that China has imposed on the World Minerals Order, manipulation would be probably near the top. And here's why. It's not just rare earths, it's also nickel, it's cobalt. It's a playbook that they've actually replicated. What China does is they come in and they produce a lot, and these are state-backed companies. And so what they do is you produce more and more and more and more, and global prices go down, 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 and down. And then it creates an environment where it's simply uncompetitive for a Western company that has fiduciary responsibilities to their shareholder to stay open. So I'll give you an example with nickel, right? Is Chinese companies in Indonesia have massively ramped up production. Between 2020 and 2026, you're going to see a fourfold increase in annual nickel production. Now, at this time, it's become so unprofitable that BHP, an Australian company, has actually closed their big nickel mine in Australia, and Glencore, a Swiss company, has closed their operation in New Caledonia. So, what China is doing is essentially increasing their share of global dominance by forcing other companies out of business. Same thing happened with rare earths, which we talk a lot about now because of the recent export restrictions. In the 2010s, when we really should have been building rare earths investment, we didn't. And part of it was because China started producing more. People don't realize the US was once one of the top rare earths producers in the world. But by China creating more, it forced prices down. And so other countries, including especially the US, we actually reduced our own production. And it gave this runway to China to have that global dominance. How to counter that is a really hard challenge because we talk about all kinds of mechanisms like do we do a price floor, right? Where if, for the US, if it drops below a certain price, we pay the difference to the mineral producer. The difficulty with that, we've heard this with the current administration, is that there's no end in sight for China's market manipulation. It's not like we think, okay, in 2 years they're going to stop and prices will return back to normal. So it could end up being an indefinite subsidy to counter China. But the reality is, for how important minerals are in this global world order, every G7 country has a mineral strategy, right? Many G20s, many emerging economies. The reason why we're still facing a structural shortfall is prices are so low that private companies don't want to do it. So mining investment is not congruent with what we see to be our future demand outlook and our security needs, and that's a price story.
The 7 rare earth elements that the Chinese have banned, I've heard different assessments of the impact on the United States, on commercial sectors and defense industries. And some people say it is not that significant, and others say that this could be incredibly damaging to U.S. national security. So where do you stand on that?
So it's this is an export control. So what it actually is there's a runway of export restrictions. Well, we start with something what we call the lightest end is something we call non-automatic licensing, which means a company has to apply to get a permit to export the material. Then you have quotas and tariffs, and then you go to a ban. This is actually an export non-automatic licensing. So what we've seen happen already is there's been a pause in exports while China develops their licensing system. And the licensing system means that the Chinese government is in control of who gets the material and where it goes. What's interesting about this tool is it's far more dynamic than a ban. There's something like static about a ban, right? You don't get it. But with they get increase the number of licenses and the amount coming to the US, they could decrease it. What they also did is at the same time, they put 16 American companies, 15 of which are defense and aerospace companies, on an export control list that prevents them from getting dual use material. So those companies would not be able to access rare earths. Now, these 7 minerals are actually quite significant, and I'll tell you why. There's 2 kinds of rare earths. There's lights and there's heavies. And we have some processing capabilities globally, including in the US, what we call separation for the light rare earths. But we actually have no capabilities anywhere in the world right now outside of China for the heavies. So they currently have 100% of the separation capabilities for heavy rare earths. So that's our first problem. We literally have no alternative. The second challenge that we face when it comes to these export restrictions is that we don't have a forever stockpile that we can draw down on. And the reality is, we talk a lot right now about heavy rare earths in the defense sector, right? We need them for fighter jets, warships, tanks, missiles, lasers, but you also need them for every single automobile you drive, whether it's an EV or not. Rare earths are in your stereo system in your car, for example. So, because they are this cross cutting commodity that goes into phones, computers, MRI scanners, gadolinium is in cancer treatment, for example. It's in antibiotics, it's in so many uses that it's extremely impactful because we have a limited supply to draw down on. So, we really need it. There's a limited supply. We don't have separation capabilities yet. We're going to have them because we're building them now. But that takes time. So that does create a supply and a demand crunch.
The Biden administration started to invest more in our critical minerals, I think more in opening up mines. I don't think, correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think there was much progress made in terms of processing, but beginning more mining. And I've heard some of those officials who, of course, now have left the administration say that progress has really come to a halt. And I wonder if that's true. Is there a Trump administration approach now to this critical minerals vulnerability?
So I'm going to flip that narrative on its head for a second, if you don't mind. So I'm going to take you back a few years before Biden to Trump 1. So the first executive order, actually, I lie, I'm gonna take you back to 2010. So 2010 was the first time that we saw minerals be weaponized, right? China imposed rare earth export restrictions on Japan over a fishing trawler dispute. Now we left it for a while. We didn't do anything. That was our first mistake, right? At a really critical time, because if we started building in 2010, 2011, we'd be in a very different place today. But President Trump in his first administration in 2017 actually issued the first executive order on critical minerals. And it was through this that we looked at our supply chains and we said, oh, holy moly, we are deeply reliant on foreign adversaries for critical materials. So it was under the Trump administration that we established the Development Finance Corporation, which is obviously becoming our financing tool. The first equity we did in a mining project was under Trump one, right? But again, these efforts were nascent because mining is a really long-term effort. Like on average globally, it takes 18 years to develop a mine from the time I identify a deposit to the time it's producing. So I don't get to wake up today and go, all right, I'm going to have it at the end of the calendar year. Now, what President Biden did, and this is the beauty of critical minerals, is why it's my all-time favorite thing to work on, is it's actually really bipartisan. Like if you go back and look at President Biden's executive order, it's pretty congruent with President Trump's. And what President Biden did is he did a few things. So the first thing he did was they did actually start building processing capabilities on his clock. So we gave out several for over $400 million through the Defense Production Act, for example, to start to build those rare earth separation facilities in California and Texas. We also used our Department of Energy Loan Program Office to build a graphite processing facility, and China currently processes 90% of the world's graphite. So it was another strategic vulnerability and another place they began rolling out export restrictions 2 years ago. The second thing we did under President Biden was start to think more about multilateralism, which is going to be a shift to how we're looking at minerals now. But we had the Mineral Security Partnership, for example, right, which brought together high income countries from around the world. But one of the challenges we had with that is there was a lot of talking and maybe not enough doing at times, right? We did diplomacy very well, but how we got rubber to hit the road and make sure we were putting capital behind that was one of the areas that, like, he laid the foundation of a very important effort. We also saw the G7 effort in Africa come to fruition during President Biden, the Libido Corridor project, right, which was really counter in a way to the Belt and Road Initiative and looks to build the rail and the port infrastructure to create a cost-effective route to get minerals out of Zambia, Angola, and the Democratic Republic of Congo. So the final thing that President Biden did, which was an absolutely game changer in the world of minerals, we weren't just thinking about mineral supply. We started thinking about mineral demand. Because at the end of the day, I need to encourage people to buy mineral intensive goods, big ones, if I want people to invest in future mineral projects. Otherwise, I'm building supply, and where does it go? Which is actually a problem we have now. Is he created the Inflation Reduction Act, which put that tax credit in the $7,500 if your minerals were mined and processed in the US, a free trade agreement country, or Japan that we had a critical minerals agreement with. So it created that demand side at the end of the day. Now, when we look at the Trump administration, it's like, I don't know about you, but I've never been busier in the last few months. Like critical minerals are like front and center. And President Trump is prioritizing all of the above, right? We've seen he's looking to address the domestic bottlenecks. So you're right. We did not do a lot of domestic mining in the last 4 years. And some of that was to that friction between indigenous communities and government and mining companies. We saw that play out with the greater sensitivity in the previous administration. This administration has prioritized in their executive order identifying priority projects, which they've already done, unlocking those barriers to get those permitted. They've also prioritized minerals abroad. We saw that Trump's special envoy to the Congo, Boulos, came out to the media last week and said there would be a minerals deal in the next 2 months. And obviously, Ukraine being a bit of a different deal. Greenland, minerals have set front and center. We've seen it be on the ground and under the sea with deep sea mining. So we're kind of, and we want to build our processing facilities on Pentagon bases is some of the conversation. So we really are going home abroad above ground, underwater, processing, mining, a lot of efforts. But besides, I would say potentially the Inflation Reduction Act and a shift between from multilateralism to bilateralism, the core objectives have actually largely remained the same.
I want to just briefly go back to 2010 because you mentioned, of course, the incident with the fishing boat and Japan being the target of restrictions on the export by China of rare earth minerals. And if I recall correctly, the Japanese actually woke up to this problem and did respond, even though the United States really didn't. And you say, as you explained, it wasn't really until later that we really started stepping up. So is Japan now in a better place today? Are they less vulnerable than we are? And obviously, we shouldn't be bringing all of this capability just to the United States. We should be working in building trusted supply chains. So are there then opportunities for us to work with Japan and then with what other countries so that we can actually have a multiplier effect and quickly reduce our vulnerabilities that we have to China's dominance?
Japan is probably the country we have to learn the most from because they've done so well. So here's an example. I was down at a rare earth mine last year in Namibia, and it's 51% owned by Jogmac. And one of the things that I learned that they do really well is that they actually, where they put in equity investment, they get proportional offtake to Japanese companies. So they're not just thinking about, oh, I want to have minerals or because they don't have a lot at home. It's not a mineral rich country. They're not just thinking about minerals or processing. They're thinking about the mine to manufacture good, right? They're thinking, I need the rare earths to be able to manufacture all these end uses. And they align their financing strategy with the offtake needs of Japanese companies. So when we look at that model, having been very effective, a lot of what we need to do going forward is acknowledge a few things. First of all, when you look at the amount of capital that China has put to this problem, we're never going to compete with that. It's way too big, right? You know this. It's huge. Between the infrastructure, the mines, the processing, we're going nowhere near that number. So we're going to need to pool capital. We have a paper coming out this week, and it looks at what the G7's role is, which obviously Japan is really critical. Everybody's got different advantages in the G7. So first, we need to pool capital. The second thing we need to do is we need technical know-how. China actually cut the world off. They banned the export of rare earth processing technologies in December 2023. And it was an oh crap moment because what we realized is between Australia, Canada, and America, there were parts of that supply chain that we actually never learned how to do. And that was the technical know-how is we were fine with them doing it. We didn't learn to do it. So the technical know-how of key allied nations is going to be really critical as well. Then the third thing and the final thing that we need to ensure is I want to make sure that when we're financing a project in the US or in an allied country that the offtake doesn't turn around and go to China. And this is a really critical problem that we have in the US. Sometimes we don't have the bird's eye picture of the importance of vertical integration to make sure that where we're financing a project, it's going to an allied refiner or processor and then an allied manufacturer. So we are looking, for example, at financing a project in Brazil right now that's for rare earths. And then the CEO of that mine actually came out and said, we've already signed offtake with China. And part of that is there's limited capabilities elsewhere, but all we're doing is cementing their global dominance when we do that. So again, we need to make sure we don't manufacture everything. So to make sure that that offtake of the projects we're supporting stays in friendly hands is going to be really critical. And this is particularly true from a coordination approach in emerging markets where costs are often higher, risks are higher. So you also distribute the risk that we face.
What are your biggest concerns regarding what China might do going forward in the critical minerals area? Do you think that they really have the enforcement capability domestically to really inflict pain on the United States if they actually start completely banning some of these critical mineral exports? I remember going back to 2010 that there were many stories about how there were Chinese companies that actually delivered some of these rare earth minerals that the that the government was trying to prevent from being exported to Japan, they just went through third countries and markets. And if you look at Japan's import data, it looked like they actually were not importing much less. And you had provincial level governments that were perfectly happy to try and send these minerals to Japan. So enforcement was a really big problem back then. I don't know if it would be today. I would think that under Xi Jinping that he would have better control and be able to achieve whatever objectives that he has if he decides to really turn the screws on the U.S. So what are you concerned that China might do next in this space?
So China, a couple years ago, when they first rolled out, germanium and gallium restrictions, I remember there was a White House official in the Biden administration who said, well, we know they just have a list of all the things we're vulnerable in, right? Where they have an advantage and that can be rolled out steadily. And it's kind of what we've seen play out, right? Every few months, you see another restriction come out. And these are all pretty consequential for the US. So, given the scale of our reliance on China, there's still more room for us to be squeezed. Obviously, rare earths were really significant. The thing we have to remember, though, is this was done in retaliation to tariffs. And so it'll be real. What China did was essentially bring minerals into a tariff war because they have this absolute advantage on heavy rare earths. So it'll be really interesting. One of the things I'm waiting and watching to see is how the meetings this week go in Switzerland between China and the US. It's, obviously these are all conversations about tariffs, but minerals are very much part of that conversation now. After the heavy rare earth restrictions, Washington was nervous because we realized we actually don't have capability yet and we don't have a huge supply of them to go forever. Couple months maybe. So that would be the first. I think the second thing I would say about enforcement, I suspect enforcement is better now, and personally, I wouldn't want to violate the Chinese president. That's just me. I think there is better enforcement. Now, we may see other workarounds via Europe, of course, especially. Now, there's two ways to go about a mineral restriction, right? One is we put some value addition in. So we take something to Europe, we do a little bit of value addition to it, and then we export it from there. The second is a traditional kind of transshipment. It's literally just going via somewhere. Japan has a advantage being much closer to China that allows it to facilitate a certain amount of smuggling. America is really far away, so it's a little bit harder to get away under the radar with big ships of heavy bulk materials. A little bit harder. There's always leakage. There are other countries. Congo put in a cobalt export ban. There is still leakage. You'll never seal off borders completely, but I suspect it's probably better than it was in 2010.
So, last question. If the United States pursued all of the recommendations that you've put forward and invested resources in our critical minerals mining and separation and processing, at how long approximately, general time frame, would it take to catch up or really eliminate the vulnerabilities that we have? And you can include in that we actually are working together with our allies, which I hope we will be.
Yeah, so I don't think we're going to catch up anytime soon. You have to remember, China built this advantage through 40 years of effort, right? It's not an advantage that can be achieved in a presidential administration. Like, we are laying the seeds to ensure that we have minerals, down the road. Realistically, the projects that we're investing in home and abroad now, 10 to 15 years, probably. Depending on where they are in project development. Some projects are a little bit quicker, but generally 10 to 15 years. So we really needed to start 15 years ago in a way. You can build a refinery much quicker, and that's important. So refineries take much less time than actually building a mine. So some of those things can be a couple of years. The difficulty with refining, and this is going to go back to prices, is because China has manipulated the market, there's action and prices have come down. It's very unprofitable to process. Like in copper right now, it's like cash negative. Zinc is like cash negative. You literally lose money on that phase. And there's why companies don't want to build them. It's because they're not making money on it. So, how government support is leveraged, particularly on the processing side. Like in copper, I get 95% of my value when I take it out of the ground. You get so little on that midstream phase that nobody wants to build a copper smelter. So, how government subsidies fill that or support fills that midstream gap will depend on how quickly those come online.
We've been talking with Grace Baskaran, who is director of the Critical Minerals Security Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Thanks so much for joining us, Gracelin. Great conversation.
Thanks for having me.